The street was quiet that morning in Harbor Vista, the kind of quiet that settles over a town before people have fully woken. A marine layer hung low, thick enough to soften the outlines of houses and parked cars. From a distance, the block looked like any other modest neighborhood of the port city, a place where families had built their routines around shift work, school schedules, and the constant rattle of freight lines. But today, something felt different. A stillness clung to the air, as if the street itself was holding its breath. Marked units rolled to a stop in front of a small, aging bungalow. Curtains twitched in nearby windows as a few neighbors watched, unsure of what they were seeing, but old enough to know that this level of presence rarely came without a reason. The door to the house opened slowly, and a man stepped out under the watch of officers waiting on the walkway. He looked older than his years, with a slight stoop, the posture of someone who had lived most of his life in the same few square miles and expected to live out the rest of his days the same way. No one would have picked him out of a crowd or remembered anything unusual about him. And yet, as the cuffs clicked into place, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if some long-hidden truth had finally risen to the surface. The officers guided him down the steps. His slippers scuffed against the concrete, the sound almost swallowed by the dense fog hanging over the street. A neighbor across the road covered her mouth, eyes wide. Another whispered something to her husband. Word spread quickly, in murmurs and glances, before anyone understood what was really happening, before anyone knew why the quiet man in the small house was being taken away in a convoy of unmarked cars. Inside the bungalow, investigators moved room to room with deliberate patience. They noted the ordinary details, the neatly folded blankets on the couch, a collection of old tools in the garage, a calendar marked only with doctor's appointments and grocery reminders. Everything looked harmless, familiar, the kind of place a man his age might live alone without drawing attention. But beneath that normalcy, a tension lingered, an uneasiness tied to the fact that the arrest had come from something pulled out of the past, something preserved, almost forgotten, but not lost. On the kitchen table lay a single printed page bearing a partial DNA profile, the fluorescent peaks rising and falling like an EKG. Beneath it, another sheet displayed a genealogical chart narrowing to a single branch, a name written in clean, determined handwriting. The house was now a crime scene, not because anything inside it revealed violence, but because something outside it, something decades old, had pointed detectives straight to its door. A few blocks away, in the cold case unit at Harbor Vista Police Headquarters, the evidence board had shifted shape overnight. Photographs of women, each representing a life cut short, were aligned in careful rows. Dates, locations, and notes formed a pattern that investigators had missed for years. At the center of the board was a single image, a sun-faded Polaroid of three young women laughing at a bus stop, their expressions bright and genuine. It was pinned with a new purpose now. The Polaroid held a secret no one had recognized at the time it was taken. Not the girls who posed under the harsh afternoon sun. Not the mother who had tucked it into a drawer for years before slipping it into a plastic sleeve and carrying it to community vigils. Not the detectives who photocopied it into the early case files before the years smudged the lines and dulled the faces. The truth sat quietly in the background of that image, waiting for the world to learn how to look. Detective Elena Ruiz stood in front of the board, her eyes drawn to the photograph again. She had spent months reviewing every scrap of evidence from the old cases, filing down the rough edges, rebuilding what had been overlooked when the city was different, when resources were scarce and priorities shifted elsewhere. Each time she returned to the Polaroid, she felt the same thing, a sense of closeness to the moment before the violence began, the moment when everything was still whole. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The arrest was already underway, and the silence in the unit felt like respect for the victims, for their families, for the decades they had waited for someone to see what had always been there. Later that day, as news of the arrest reached the families, reactions rippled quietly through the community. Some felt relief, others disbelief. many a kind of subdued anger that it had taken so long. But there was something else too, a sense of gravity settling over Harbor Vista, a feeling that a story buried under years of neglect had finally been pulled to the surface. The fog thickened outside the precinct windows, clinging to the edges of the building like it was listening. Back in the interrogation room, the man sat alone at the table. His gaze was fixed downward, not defiant, not defeated, just distant, as though he were studying a memory only he understood. He said nothing when detectives entered. He said nothing when the file was placed in front of him. He said nothing when he saw the Polaroid, printed in clean resolution, the truck in the background unmistakable this time. The years had changed him, softened the sharpness of his features, but something in his stillness hinted that silence had been his shield long before this day arrived. Outside, the marine layer gradually began to lift, revealing the outlines of cranes at the harbor, container trucks rumbling in the distance, and the small corners of the city that had shaped the lives of everyone involved. Harbor Vista had awakened to a day it didn't expect, and nothing about the neighborhood would feel quite the same again. To understand how this began, we go back to 1988. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. Mara Salinas woke before sunrise most days, long before the fog had lifted from the edges of Harbor Vista. The air in her apartment always held a faint chill at that hour, the kind that crept in from the thin window frames and the constant salt-laced breeze outside. She didn't mind it. The cool quiet gave her a moment to herself before the world began asking things of her. She would light the small lamp on the counter, fix a cup of instant coffee, and open her night school textbook while the kettle clicked softly behind her. Those stolen minutes, just her, a book, and the hum of distant freight engines, felt like the closest thing she had to stillness. Her son, Daniel, usually wandered into the kitchen a little later, rubbing sleep from his eyes, wearing the oversized t-shirt she'd bought him from the thrift store down the street. He was 6 then, curious and slightly shy, with a habit of asking questions faster than she could answer them. Dee set a bowl of cereal on the table and listened as he told her about the drawings he wanted to make, or the game he hoped to play at recess. She made sure to look him in the eye, even when she was tired. When you talk to someone, her mother had always said, you show them they matter by listening. Mara carried that with her the way some people carried jewelry. By 7:30, they were out the door, her hand wrapped around Daniel's as they walked toward his elementary school. The route took them past the convenience store, where the owner always nodded at her, past the laundromat, with its constant whir of machines, and past the bus stop where she and her friends used to meet before life pulled them in different directions. Every time she walked by that stop, she remembered the day they took the Polaroid. She wasn't posing. She had been laughing so hard she couldn't stand still. Someone had said something stupid, something small and joyful, and the camera caught it exactly as it was, a second of uncomplicated happiness. She kept the photo clipped to her refrigerator with a chipped magnet shaped like a strawberry, the edges softening more each year. After leaving Daniel at school, she would catch the old city bus that ran along the waterfront and take it to the diner where she worked the morning shift. Harbor Vista Diner wasn't anything special from the outside, a faded sign, scratched windows, a squeaky door. But inside, it was the kind of place where people settled into the same booths day after day. The regulars knew her by name. Some asked about Daniel. Others left folded napkins with small notes of encouragement when they saw her studying during her breaks. She didn't talk much about her plans, but those who knew her best understood she wasn't meant to stay behind that counter forever. Night school wasn't easy on top of work and parenting, but she treated every assignment like proof she could build something better, even if progress came inch by inch. She worked with 2 close friends, Lita, who had a sharp voice and a softer heart, and Carmen, who always brought extra food for everyone. They traded jokes during slow hours and shared rides to the bus stop when shifts ended late. On Fridays, when tips were a little better, they sometimes split a slice of pie before heading home. Those were the moments Mara cherished the most: simple, unremarkable, full of warmth. She found comfort in the mundane, in the rhythm of pouring coffee, refilling ketchup bottles, and hearing the hiss of the griddle as breakfast orders piled in. Her mother, Rosa, often stopped by the diner after her own morning shift cleaning motel rooms. She would sit at the counter with a cup of tea while Mara stole a few minutes to talk. They didn't discuss the hard parts of their lives out loud, but each understood what the other carried. When Rosa looked at her daughter, she saw the same determination she'd seen in the photo pinned on the fridge, the one from years earlier when life was lighter. In the afternoons, Mara would pick up Daniel from school and walk into the public library. She liked the quiet there, the shelves standing like protective walls around them. Daniel flipped through picture books while she reviewed her class notes, occasionally glancing at him over the top of the pages. He liked to sit close to her, leaning into her side as he whispered questions about the stories. She loved those moments, the closeness, the feeling that despite the struggles, they were building something steady. On the last day of her life, nothing felt unusual at first. The day began the same way: coffee, textbooks, the morning walk to school. She kissed Daniel's hair before he ran through the gates, his backpack bouncing lightly behind him. At the diner, she tied her apron, greeted the regulars, and slipped into the familiar routine. She joked with Lida about the fog that seemed to cling stubbornly to the windows. She showed Carmen a coupon for a new grocery store opening 2 towns over. She laughed at something an older man muttered about the weather. A small moment stood out, though she didn't think much of it at the time. During her break, Mara pulled the Polaroid from her wallet, the original one, not the photocopy she kept at home. The edges were curling, the color fading into that familiar sun-washed look. She studied the faces of her friends, remembering the feel of the afternoon when the picture had been taken. She held it for a moment longer than usual before slipping it back into the clear sleeve. It was a gesture no one noticed, but it lingered in the air like a quiet reminder of how fragile memory could be. As her shift neared its end, she called her mother to say she'd be home a little later than usual. The diner needed someone to stay an extra hour, and she didn't mind. Rosa offered to pick up Daniel and keep him for dinner. It was an ordinary conversation, so ordinary that neither of them sensed anything amiss. When she hung up, Mara felt a small wave of tiredness settle over her, but it wasn't unusual. Life often felt like a long stretch of late nights and early mornings. When the last customer left, she cleaned her station, untied her apron, and stepped into the fog-heavy night outside the diner. The neon sign flickered faintly overhead, glowing against the moisture in the air. She pulled her sweater tighter around her and began the walk toward the bus stop she had known her whole life. The sounds of the harbor drifted across the distance, metal groaning, engines humming, the rhythmic pulse of a city that never completely slept. Somewhere behind her, a car idled near the edge of the lot. She didn't turn. It was not unusual for vehicles to pause in that area, where streets dipped into industrial backroads. The bus would arrive any minute. She could already imagine the warmth of her mother's kitchen, the steam rising from a pot on the stove, Daniel waiting to show her something he'd drawn. She walked a few more steps, unaware that this would be the final stretch of her routine, unaware that someone else had been watching her life intersect with his shadows for far too long. And in the faint glow of the streetlight, the last image she carried with her was the memory of that Polaroid: 3 young women laughing on a sunlit afternoon, believing the world was brighter than it truly was. By the time Mara stepped away from the diner that night, Harbor Vista was wrapped in a fog thick enough to blur the outlines of passing cars and soften the glow of streetlights. The air held the faint tang of salt from the harbor, mixed with the diesel of container trucks that rumbled along the freight routes even at that late hour. It was a familiar backdrop to her walk to the bus stop, a ritual she had repeated countless times. The sidewalks glistened with a thin layer of moisture, and the neon sign above the diner pulsed weakly behind her. At 10:54 p.m., The bus tracker app on her old flip phone showed that her usual bus was delayed by several minutes. She slipped the phone back into her bag. These sorts of delays were normal on nights when the fog settled thickest along the waterfront. She glanced toward the direction where the bus would arrive, but the road beyond the stop was invisible in the dense white haze. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, pulling her sweater closer around her shoulders. A car slowed as it passed behind her. She heard the faint hum of its engine, the soft crunch of tires over damp gravel. She didn't turn. Cars often crept through this part of town, uncertain of the lanes when visibility dropped so low. She kept her gaze forward, focusing on the faint glow of the streetlight overhead. It flickered gently, almost in rhythm with the pounding of her tired pulse. At 10:58 p.m., the fog thickened further, drifting between the streetlights like smoke. Mara checked the bus schedule again, squinting at the dim screen. The time now showed a longer delay. She exhaled slowly, the breath curling in the cold. The diner had been short-staffed, and she had stayed later than planned. Daniel would already be asleep at her mother's. She felt a small ache of guilt for not being the one to tuck him in that night. The car that had passed earlier reappeared from the haze and slowed again near the mouth of the parking lot. This time it paused. She still didn't turn. She assumed the driver was lost in the fog or unsure of the turnoff. People often hesitated in this exact spot, unsure whether they were entering a loading dock road or the side street leading to the bus stop. At 11:03 p.m., she stepped closer to the curb, peering down the empty road, hoping to catch the faint silhouette of the approaching bus. Instead, the fog swallowed everything. She extended her hand toward the pole of the bus stop sign, just to feel something solid. Her fingers brushed against cold metal. The moisture clinging to it chilled her skin. Behind her, the sound of the car door opening broke the stillness. For a moment, Mara froze. It wasn't alarming on its own. People often stepped out to check directions or to peer at street signs hidden by fog. But there was something about the silence that followed, a quietness too deliberate, too calculated, that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. She turned slightly but saw only a vague shape in the fog. A figure stood near the car, motionless. Her breath quickened. She shifted her bag on her shoulder, and the faint jangle of her keychain, now nearly worn silent by years of use, seemed unnaturally loud. She took a step forward, intending to move closer to the main road. The figure behind her took a step too. The rest unfolded in a blur she never fully perceived. A sudden arm reaching through the fog, a grip tightening around her upper arm, her breath caught in her chest, the soft thud of her bag hitting the ground. The bus stop sign tilted as she reached out, reflexively, trying to steady herself. The fog swallowed her voice before it could become anything more than a weak gasp. At 11:06 p.m., her phone buzzed with a late-night reminder from her night school app, an assignment deadline she would never submit. The screen glowed briefly where it lay on the sidewalk, its light fading as the fog crept over it. The bus arrived at 11:12 p.m., its headlights cutting through the haze. The driver saw the abandoned bag near the curb. He radioed dispatch immediately, reporting what he thought was a left-behind belonging or a passenger who had wandered away. He didn't see the faint scuff marks leading into the fog or the single key that had slipped from her chain and landed near the front tire of his bus. During the next several hours, the life that had been pulled from that bus stop moved into a different part of Harbor Vista, the industrial backlot near the old refineries. These were areas the city never fully lit, where narrow access roads wound between chain-link fences and metal storage units. Fog gathered there too, mixing with the residue from the refineries and settling over the cracked asphalt in a pale, poisonous blanket. At 3:41 a.m., a sanitation worker named Theo Halper made his rounds, guiding his truck down one of those forgotten lots. He had worked the night shift for nearly 20 years and had learned to trust his instincts about what belonged and what didn't in the labyrinth of empty spaces. That morning, The fog was so thick he could barely see beyond his headlights. As he stepped out to move a toppled trash bin, something caught his eye, a shape lying near the far edge of the lot. It was still, pale, barely visible. Theo hesitated, unsure whether the shape was a discarded mannequin, a large bag, or something else entirely. But as he moved closer, the dread in his chest tightened. He recognized the angle of the arm, the way the sweater sleeve had folded, the unnatural stillness. He stopped several feet away, unable to move forward. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, dialing emergency services. His voice cracked, but he managed to give the location, the landmarks, the details as best he could. He didn't try to approach again. He couldn't. The fog hung thick enough that the world around him felt suspended, trapped between the quiet of the night and the horror he had stumbled upon. Police arrived minutes later. Officers stepped carefully, their eyes darting between the ground and the shadowed corners of the lot. They noted the positioning of the body, the way the fog seemed to cling to her clothing. A detective knelt beside the scene, observing the details without touching anything. A spent shell casing gleamed gold near her left side. Her keychain lay several inches away, but the keys were missing. The bag she had dropped at the bus stop was nowhere in sight. Officers expanded the perimeter, marking tire impressions that curved near the entrance of the lot. They recorded the faint scuff marks along the ground, though the fog and moisture made patterns difficult to read. One officer pointed out an unusual detail: a line of disturbed gravel leading from the center of the lot toward the far fence, as though something had been dragged but then lifted suddenly. At 4:07 a.m., an officer found a small plastic sleeve partially tucked into Mara's sweater pocket. Inside, it was the Polaroid, worn, sun-faded edges curling from years of handling. The officer didn't recognize its significance yet. He simply logged it as a personal item and placed it into an evidence bag. As the investigation continued, another strange detail emerged. Near the edge of the lot, slightly hidden in the grass, lay a faint shoe print, not from Mara, but from a heavy boot with a distinct worn tread. The shape was incomplete, smudged by moisture, but it didn't match any worker who routinely accessed the area. The print faced toward the road, then disappeared entirely, as if the person had stepped onto something solid or into a vehicle. The oddest clue, however, came when a detective studying the scene noticed a small indentation in the dirt near where the body lay. It looked as though someone had briefly placed something down, something rectangular, about the size of a portable toolbox. Whatever it had been, it was gone now. But the mark remained, barely visible in the fog-soaked soil. By sunrise, the fog had thinned enough to reveal the shape of the refinery towers beyond the fence. The officers took their final photographs and began preparing the scene for the coroner. The early light cast a pale glow over the lot, illuminating the objects left behind: the casing, the keychain, the footprints, the Polaroid. Clues scattered like pieces of a puzzle that wouldn't form a clear picture for decades. As the detectives packed up, one of them glanced toward the fence line again. The disturbed gravel near the fence and the partial boot print bothered him, lingering in his mind like an unanswered question. It would be logged, written into the report, then slowly buried under the years that followed. The trail would go cold. The odd details would fade. But the impression left behind, the one piece that couldn't be explained, would one day return with meaning, resurfacing when the truth finally demanded to be seen. In the weeks after Mara's body was found, Harbor Vista police poured themselves into the case with a determination that felt sharp and immediate. Detectives combed through the industrial lot again and again, hoping something they had missed in the fog-lit early morning would reveal itself. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks faded into months, the initial urgency began to erode beneath the weight of too many unanswered questions. The first lead came from a man who claimed he had seen someone running near the refinery fence the night of the murder. He described the figure as tall and wearing a dark jacket, but he couldn't recall a face. Detectives brought him into the station, asking him to retrace his route, to think about the exact time he saw the shadowed figure. His story shifted each time he repeated it. Eventually, he admitted he might have been confusing that night with one earlier in the week. The tip was filed noted and quietly set aside. A second lead pointed toward a local transient known to wander through the industrial corridors late at night. Officers found him sleeping near one of the warehouses. They questioned him for hours, pressing him about where he had been on the night Mara disappeared. He insisted he had been sleeping behind a dumpster across town, and when detectives checked, they discovered that a convenience store security camera had indeed caught him on footage at the exact time of the abduction. The lead dissolved instantly. The detectives kept going. They knocked on doors, questioned nearby residents, and tracked down every vehicle recorded passing through the area around the time the bus driver reported seeing her abandoned bag. One car caught their attention, a faded silver sedan that circled twice before heading toward the industrial roads. When officers located the owner, he explained he had been searching for a lost dog. His teenage daughter confirmed it, producing photos she had taken on her phone that night while trying to coax the skittish animal back home. Another dead end. With each failed lead, pressure mounted. Reporters began asking whether the killing was connected to drug activity in the area. Some implied Mara had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a phrasing that weighed heavily on her family. Rosa visited the precinct often, sometimes sitting silently in the lobby for hours until a detective could speak with her. She only had one question each time. Is there anything new? The answer was always some variation of no. One afternoon, two detectives returned to the diner where Mara had worked, hoping the staff or customers might remember something unusual from that night. Lita wiped her hands on her apron, eyes filling with tears as she tried to recall the final conversation she'd had with her friend. Carmen sat at a booth, shaking her head slowly. She was tired, Carmen said softly, but nothing felt strange. Nothing felt wrong. A customer at the far end of the counter interrupted, saying he had seen a man outside the diner earlier that week who seemed to be watching the staff through the window. He described a broad-shouldered figure with a thick beard. Investigators followed the lead, tracking down a man who matched the description. He turned out to be a delivery driver waiting for a late order, backed up by a logbook entry and timestamp receipts. Another path closed. Meanwhile, the forensic lab processed the physical items recovered from the scene. The casing was examined for fingerprints, but the surface was too smooth and too exposed to the elements. The keychain offered no prints either. Analysts tried to lift biological traces from the clothing but found nothing viable. Moisture, fog, and time had washed away most of what could have been useful. The investigative team even revisited the indentation found near the body, the rectangular mark that had puzzled one of the early officers. They attempted to match the shape with known toolboxes or equipment carried by workers at the refineries, but none matched the precise dimensions. Without additional context, it was little more than a curiosity, a cryptic clue without a story. By the end of the first year, the case had stalled. New crimes, new emergencies, and new budget limitations began to shift attention. Detectives tried to resist the gradual slide into inertia, but the momentum faltered. They reassigned officers, pared down overtime hours, and redirected resources to active cases. One hallway conversation between supervisors, overheard by a young officer in passing, captured the shift plainly. "We can't keep pouring time into something with no movement," one said. "We owe the family something," the other replied. "We do, but we owe the living cases more." The second year brought different investigators, different approaches, and a different level of energy. One detective became convinced that the case might be tied to a string of robberies in nearby towns, all involving late-night victims and similar dump sites. He dove into the possibility with intensity, mapping the crimes against known offender release dates. Eventually, he tracked down a man who seemed to fit the pattern, a former convict with a history of violence. Detectives interviewed him 3 times. Each time, the man denied involvement. When they pressed him harder, he demanded a lawyer. DNA from a separate case later placed him miles away on the night of Mara's murder. Another lead evaporated. Media interest surged briefly when another body was found in a field 2 towns over. Reporters speculated about a serial predator along the coast, spinning theories about truck stop corridors and fog-covered highways. But that case turned out to be domestic in nature, unrelated to Mara. When the spotlight shifted away, Harbor Vista slipped back into its familiar rhythm of silence. Years passed. Detectives rotated in and out of the department. Files shifted from one metal drawer to another, gradually sinking deeper into the archive. The Polaroid found in Mara's pocket became simply another item logged in the report, attached as a scanned copy in the digital case system. The faint bootprint was labeled non-determinative. The indentation in the soil remained mentioned only in a footnote. There was nothing to tie them together. At one point, a detective reached out to a retired refinery worker, hoping he might recall someone suspicious from that era. The man's memory was fogged by time and age. He pointed to half a dozen names of people who had come and gone, none of whom had any known connection to the crime. When detectives tried to follow up, they found that several were deceased, others had moved out of state, and none had left records strong enough to pursue. Rosa continued to stop by the precinct with unwavering regularity. Sometimes she brought cookies for the officers. Sometimes she simply brought herself, sitting quietly until someone could speak with her. On one visit, she asked to see the Polaroid they had found. A young detective brought it out for her. She held it carefully, touching the edges as if afraid it might crumble. She loved this picture, Rosa said. She said it reminded her that life could be bright. The detective didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded and returned the photo to its sleeve. As the 10th anniversary approached, interest in the case returned briefly when a local journalist wrote an article about Harbor Vista as forgotten victims. The story highlighted the lack of progress and questioned whether vulnerable communities were receiving equal attention from law enforcement. One line from the piece echoed through the precinct. "We have not forgotten them, but it often feels as if the system has." Detectives received dozens of calls afterward, people convinced they had seen something, remembered something, or heard something over the years. Each call was logged, assessed, pursued, and eventually found lacking. A woman said she saw a man near the diner that night with a visibly trembling hand. Another insisted she knew the killer personally, but could not produce a name. A man claimed his coworker had confessed something drunkenly 20 years earlier, but when contacted, the coworker denied the conversation entirely and suggested the caller had a grudge. All of it again dissolved. Eventually, a supervisor drafted an internal memo recommending the case be reclassified as inactive due to lack of viable leads. It wasn't a closure, not officially, but it placed the file into a drawer where only cold case units would revisit it, and even then, only when time allowed. On the final day, the primary team worked the case. One detective lingered in the evidence room, holding the box labeled Salinas Mara 1988. The cardboard had softened at the corners. The tape holding the evidence bags had yellowed slightly. The detective placed the box on a high shelf, slid it gently into place, and stood there for a moment, staring at it. "We tried," he whispered. No one else heard him. Outside, the fog drifted over the coastline once more, thick enough to blur the lights of the harbor. Back in the precinct, the last official note added to the file read, "No new actionable evidence at this time." And then the case, like so many others in quiet towns and forgotten corridors, fell into stillness, waiting for a future that had not yet arrived. The years following the collapse of the initial investigation moved slowly for the Salinas family. Not in the way time usually passes, but in the way it lingers when something essential has been taken. For Rosa, each morning began with the same ritual. She touched the corner of the Polaroid on her refrigerator, tracing the fading outline of her daughter's smile. The colors had softened into pale pastels over the years. The once bright afternoon sunlight in the picture washed into a muted haze. Still, It remained the truest version of Mara she could hold on to a moment, frozen before the world stepped in and fractured everything. Daniel grew taller, then leaner, then broader in the shoulders, the way boys do when childhood starts slipping behind them. He kept the Polaroid in a small box under his bed, wrapped in tissue paper, because he didn't like it sitting out where the air could wear it down even more. When he was young, he asked questions Rosa struggled to answer. What happened? Why it happened? Why no one seemed able to find the person responsible? As he grew older, the questions quieted, replaced by a determined silence. Sometimes she'd catch him staring at the photo as if trying to memorize every shade and shadow, as if trying to imagine the sound of her laugh the way it once filled the kitchen. Life moved around them, reshaping Harbor Vista in ways large and small. The old convenience store by the bus stop closed. A cafe took its place, with fresh paint and warm lights that didn't flicker. The laundromat installed new machines. The refineries beyond the industrial lots built taller fencing and added warning signs in bright fonts. Streets were repaved and new apartment buildings rose quickly in the spaces where older homes once stood. But no matter how much the landscape changed, a certain heaviness hung over the city, a knowledge shared quietly among those who remembered the night Mara didn't come home. Rosa continued attending the annual remembrance service held at the community center each autumn. She always brought the same small bouquet of white flowers, placing it in front of the framed photographs of victims whose cases had gone unsolved. Over time, the table grew more crowded. Some families brought candles, others pinned letters. Volunteers filled in the missing details, arranging everything with a careful tenderness. The room was usually quiet for most of the service, except for the soft sound of people breathing, some holding back tears, others letting them fall freely. Each year, the number of familiar faces changed. Some families moved away seeking new beginnings, though grief often followed them. Some stopped attending entirely, unable to relive the same ache. But Rosa remained. She sat in the same chair toward the front, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze steady on the photographs. She believed, stubbornly and unapologetically, that justice would come, even if time had turned the path to it winding and dim. For Daniel, the passage of years brought responsibilities and choices. He finished school, took on part-time work, and later landed a job at a local repair shop. The consistency of routine fixing engines, replacing belts, diagnosing rattles, gave him a sense of grounding. Yet every afternoon when he walked home, he passed the street where his mother had been last seen. He didn't have to. It wasn't on the most direct route, but he found himself drawn there anyway, as if some part of him needed to acknowledge the space she had stepped through before disappearing into the fog. When he turned 15, he asked Rosa if he could go with her to the precinct to see the file again. The officer on duty retrieved it, handling the box carefully. Daniel studied the contents with a seriousness unusual for his age. He held the Polaroid, still in its evidence sleeve, his reflection faint on the plastic. Why haven't they done more? He asked quietly. Rosa didn't know how to explain years of budget shifts, reassigned detectives, or the way certain cases fall into quiet corners of the system. She only said, "Sometimes people forget what matters. Sometimes they don't look hard enough. But that doesn't mean we stop." Daniel didn't say anything, but his jaw tightened, and something inside him settled in place, a quiet vow he carried forward. As time passed, new voices joined the effort to keep the cases alive. A local journalist named Javier began writing articles about the women who had been found along the Harbor Vista corridors during the late 80s and early 90s. He interviewed families, pieced together timelines, and pored over old police logs. His articles didn't point fingers or speculate wildly. They simply asked why certain cases had never been linked or given the kind of scrutiny they deserved. In one piece, he quoted Rosa, "We never stopped waiting. We never stopped believing someone would look again." The article gained modest traction, enough to spark conversations at community meetings and in online forums where locals exchanged memories. Someone recalled a truck that used to idle near the bus stop late at night, Another remembered a mechanic from the old port repair yard who kept to himself and often drove through the back roads. These recollections were small, uncertain, and lacked dates or specifics. But they were pieces nonetheless, drifting back toward the surface. Meanwhile, Rosa kept a small wooden box on her dresser. Inside it she placed items that had belonged to Mara: a pair of earrings shaped like small stars, a folded note from her night school instructor praising her diligence, a ticket stub from a movie she'd once taken Daniel to see, and a photocopy of the Polaroid for safekeeping. On difficult nights, she would sit on the edge of her bed and open the box, running her fingertips over the small memories that remained. As the 20th anniversary approached, Harbor Vista began to shift yet again. New developments brought in younger families. The city repainted crosswalks, upgraded streetlights, and installed surveillance cameras on several major intersections. With these changes came renewed conversations about unresolved cases. Younger residents, many of whom had never heard the details, asked questions at council meetings. Some even organized a memorial walk through the areas where victims had been found. Daniel joined them, walking silently with a photograph of his mother pinned to his jacket. He had become a man by then, broad-shouldered, quiet, carrying the same resilience Rosa had taught him. People who met him often remarked on his calm presence, unaware of the storm he had learned to hold inside. One evening, tired after a long day at the repair shop, Daniel found Rosa sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in her hands. The envelope was from a regional advocacy group that supported families of cold case victims. Their letter mentioned new forensic technologies being used successfully in other cities' techniques for analyzing degraded DNA, creating genealogical matches, and digitally enhancing old evidence. Rosa read the letter aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "They can find people now," she said. Even after so long, Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting the words settle. Something stirred in him, a flicker of hope he hadn't let himself feel in years. Around the same time, at the precinct, a new cold case detective transferred into Harbor Vista. Her name was Elena Ruiz. She had a reputation for persistence, for combing through forgotten files with a meticulous patience others lacked. On her first week, she found the box labeled Salinas Mara -1988 tucked behind several others on a high shelf. The cardboard was soft at the edges, but the writing was still clear. Elena carried it to her desk, flipping through the reports, studying the photographs, and pausing at the Polaroid sealed in its evidence sleeve. She turned it toward the light, noticing details others had glanced over. She read the interviews, the dead-end leads, the descriptions of the fog that night, and the scattered clues that had never been woven into a full picture. When Rosa and Daniel visited the precinct a few weeks later, they found Elena reviewing the file. She introduced herself with a calm confidence, inviting them to sit. She listened to their stories, asked gentle questions, and assured them that she intended to look deeper. Rosa didn't allow herself to hope too quickly. She had been disappointed before too many times to count. But something about Elena's quiet certainty made her feel a shift she hadn't felt in years. As they left the precinct that day, Daniel paused in the hallway, glancing back at the cold case office. He felt something in the air, an almost imperceptible shift, the subtle spark that comes when a long-ignored truth finally finds someone willing to pursue it. Later that night, Rosa placed the latest letter from the advocacy group into her wooden memory box. She didn't close it immediately. She let it rest open, the Polaroid visible inside, illuminated by the soft glow of her bedside lamp. She whispered a small thank you into the quiet room, not certain who she was thanking or why, only that after decades of waiting, a new possibility seemed to be rising. The fog rolled in over Harbor Vista once more, drifting through the streets as it always had, but this time the air felt different, lighter, less heavy with unanswered questions. Somewhere in the precinct, a forgotten file had been opened again, and with it, a door long sealed by time began to shift. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. The day Elena Ruiz reopened the evidence box, the cold case office was unusually quiet. Files were stacked on her desk, but the one she reached for felt different from the others. The cardboard had softened with age, the ink fading slightly where Mara's name had been written decades earlier. She lifted the lid with care, as if disturbing something fragile, something long asleep. Inside lay the fragments of a life interrupted, the clothing sealed in plastic, the keychain ring with its missing keys, the Polaroid in its protective sleeve, and beneath them all, the untouched sexual assault kit that had outlasted every shift in policy and priorities. Elena studied the seals, her breath catching for a moment. Everything was intact. It was as though time had wrapped itself around the evidence, preserving it until someone finally came to ask the right questions. She logged the contents methodically, noting that the kit had never undergone modern testing. Back in 1988, the lab's technology lacked the sensitivity to extract a viable profile from samples as degraded as these. But decades had changed the landscape of forensic science. The tools now existed, tools that could give a voice to the silent pieces Mara had carried with her into those final moments. She transferred the kit to the California State Forensic Biology Center the next morning. The building sat on the outskirts of the city, sterile and clinical, a place where answers were coaxed out of the smallest traces. Lead analyst Kira Maula greeted her with a quiet nod. They had worked together before, on cases that had fallen dormant until science caught up to the truth. Kira inspected the seals with a practiced eye. "You're lucky," she said. "Most evidence this old doesn't survive this well." "I don't think luck had anything to do with it," Elena replied. "Someone cared enough to store it right." Kira began the careful process of opening the kit. Inside were the swabs and samples collected decades earlier, each still labeled in the looping handwriting of a detective long retired. The air in the room seemed to shift. Both women understood the weight of what they were unsealing. The first step was extraction. Kira used a magnetic bead-based system designed to target fragmented DNA, suspending the aged sample in a solution that would free whatever genetic material survived. The process was slow, patient, almost delicate. As the sample dissolved, Kira monitored the reaction under bright lab lights. "Degraded," she murmured, "but maybe not gone." She moved to quantification, placing tiny droplets into a real-time PCR machine. The screen flickered with numbers that slowly stabilized. 0.09 nanograms, she said. Barely enough. Barely was enough. Kira prepared the amplification mix and loaded the sample into the thermal cycler. The machine ticked through its cycles, gradually building fragments into patterns that could be read, compared, searched. Elena watched from behind the glass partition, her hands resting on the edge of the counter, her eyes fixed on the instrument. She felt a quiet anticipation rising in her chest, the kind that comes from sensing the ground shift beneath long-held silence. When the machine chimed, Kira transferred the sample into the capillary electrophoresis unit. Fluorescent markers traveled through the slender glass tube, separating by size, forming peaks and valleys across the graph that began to light up the monitor. Kira leaned toward the screen, her eyebrows tightening. "It's partial," she said, "but it's good. Better than I expected." She printed the electropherogram and handed it to Elena through the pass slot. The lines were uneven, incomplete, but legible enough to meet the threshold for a familial search. It was a beginning, the first true one they had in years. The CODIS submission went out that afternoon. 2 weeks later, the email arrived. Subject: partial match, flagged for familial review. Elena opened it immediately. Her heart thudded once, sharply, then steadied. The match pointed to a man named Galen Mercer, arrested years ago on a minor offense unrelated to anything violent. Not a suspect, not even a person of interest, but someone whose DNA indicated a close genetic relationship to the contributor of the sample. A brother, a father, a son. She contacted the forensic genealogist the state contracted for such reviews. Together they constructed the Mercer family tree, mapping names, tracing addresses, aligning dates. Old records emerged from archived databases. Employment history surfaced. The web narrowed with every branch sorted, every new name added or dismissed. The pattern converged on a single individual, Lewis Mercer, born 1958, a long-term Harbor Vista resident. He had worked as a port mechanic for most of his adult life, moving only twice in 30 years. Both moves coincided with pauses in the pattern of killings that stretched through the late 80s and early 90s. He had lived 3 blocks from the bus stop where Mara disappeared. As the genealogist drew a circle around Mercer's name, Elena felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't triumph. It was recognition of the shape of a truth that had hovered for years just beyond reach. "I want everything we have on him," she said quietly. She returned to the cold case office with the new information and pulled the Polaroid from its sleeve. The image was grainy, softened with age, but she studied the background with fresh eyes. A vehicle sat behind the 3 laughing women, barely visible in the sun glare. She took the photo to the imaging unit, asking for enhancement. They scanned it at a resolution that didn't exist when the picture was first taken. Slowly, pixels sharpened. Lines clarified. Behind the girls, parked at the curb, was an old pickup truck with a mismatched driver's side panel. The same model and color Mercer had owned at the time. The realization settled like a whisper. He had been there that day. Not a shadow, not an abstraction, an actual presence, recorded unintentionally by a camera pointed at something else entirely. Elena printed the enhanced image and set it beside the genealogical map. The pieces aligned with a quiet, devastating certainty. She drafted a request for a search warrant and delivered her findings to her lieutenant. He studied the documents for a long moment. "You're sure?" he said. "I am," she answered. The warrant was approved by the end of the day. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Harbor Vista, Elena drove to the Salinas apartment. Rosa answered the door slowly, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Daniel appeared behind her, tall now, steady, the years etched into the lines of his face. "Is it about my mother?" he asked. Elena nodded. "Yes, we have a lead." Inside, she explained the DNA breakthrough, the partial match, the genealogical link. She showed them the enhanced Polaroid, its details now brought into startling clarity. Rosa pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Daniel leaned forward, studying the truck in the corner of the photo, recognizing something familiar in the shape of the fender. "He was there," he whispered. That day, Elena didn't soften the truth. She knew they deserved honesty after so many years of evasions. "We believe the person responsible lived near the bus stop, someone who blended into the community. Someone no one suspected." Rosa closed her eyes, and a single tear slid down her cheek. But when she opened them again, there was no despair, only something firmer, more anchored. "Find him," she said. "We will," Elena replied. The fog rolled in again that night, drifting over the quiet streets of Harbor Vista, but it no longer felt like the same suffocating weight that had hung over the town for decades. Somewhere in the police station, a printer was spitting out the warrant paperwork. Somewhere in a bungalow a few blocks away, a man who had hidden in plain sight for half his life prepared dinner in silence, unaware of the shift taking place around him. Decades of stillness had cracked open. A small thread of truth had finally begun to pull free. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The morning the warrant was executed, the fog hung low over Harbor Vista, pressing close to the houses as if the air itself expected what was coming. Officers gathered quietly near the bungalow where Lewis Mercer lived, each of them aware that this moment carried the weight of decades. There was no urgency in their movements, only a steady resolve. The years of unanswered questions, the long silence left behind by the forgotten women of the city, they all converged at the small walkway leading to his door. When he stepped outside, he did so in the same unremarkable way he began every day, pulling the door closed with a slight tug, adjusting the collar of his worn jacket. The officers approached without raising their voices. He paused, confused at first, then frozen in a stillness that revealed something deeper: recognition, perhaps, or the sudden quiet collapse of a life built on hiding. His hands rose slowly. There was no struggle. Down the street, neighbors watched from behind curtains and screen doors. A few whispered to each other, trying to reconcile the familiar man who lived so quietly with the reason a line of unmarked cars now filled the block. Some stared in silence, unable to speak. Long after he was placed in the back of the vehicle, that silence lingered, pooling in the spaces between houses, sinking into the concrete the way fog seeps into the low alleys of the harbor. At the precinct, Mercer sat across from Elena Ruiz in a small interview room. He stared at the table, saying nothing. Elena placed the enhanced Polaroid in front of him, the image clear, the truck in the background unmistakable. His jaw tightened, a minimal motion almost hidden beneath years of practiced stillness, but he didn't deny it, not once. When the DNA evidence was presented, the partial profile, the genealogical match, the convergence of family lines, his shoulders sank. He didn't confess, not in the way some suspects unravel with words and regret. Instead, he simply stopped resisting. His silence was its own admission, shaped by the knowledge that the past had finally caught him. The news of his arrest traveled quickly through Harbor Vista. People gathered in small clusters near the harbor, in diners, in living rooms lit by quiet televisions. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others felt a pang of anger for the years lost. Rosa and Daniel received the call from Elena in the early afternoon. Rosa sat down slowly at the kitchen table, pressing her hand against the wooden surface as if grounding herself, while Daniel stood nearby, his expression steady but his eyes brighter than usual. "He didn't fight it," Elena said. "He knew why we were there." That night, Rosa placed a candle near the Polaroid on her dresser and let it burn until the early hours of morning. The trial began months later in a county courthouse that had seen decades of cases, though few carried the emotional gravity that filled the hallways during those weeks. Families of the victims sat together, some holding folded tissues, others gripping hands tightly. The air had a stillness to it, a kind of collective anticipation shaped by too many years of waiting. Mercer entered the courtroom, escorted by deputies, his posture smaller than before, as if he had shrunk beneath the weight of being seen. He kept his gaze forward, not looking at the families, not searching the room for sympathy he knew he wouldn't find. The prosecution laid out their case with a quiet confidence built on science and time data, genealogical mapping, testimony from experts who had dedicated their careers to restoring voices from the past. When the forensic analyst explained how the degraded sample had been recovered and amplified, her tone was steady, almost gentle. She described the peaks and valleys of the electropherogram, the markers that aligned with the Mercer lineage, the statistical probabilities that removed any lingering doubts. Jurors listened intently, some leaning forward, absorbing the weight of each technical phrase. Then came the Polaroid. The enhanced version was displayed on a screen visible to the entire room. The three young women laughed in frozen sunlight, their joy unmistakable even through decades of faded color. And behind them, caught by accident, the truck, Mercer's truck. The defense attempted to argue coincidence, but the placement, the date, the proximity to where he lived, it all formed a pattern too precise to dismiss. During one afternoon session, Rosa took the stand. She held the original Polaroid delicately, her fingers trembling only once as she lifted it for the jury to see. She spoke of her daughter's kindness, her dreams, the way she touched the photo every morning to remind herself that moments of brightness had once existed. Her voice wavered, but never broke. "She was real," she said. "She mattered. And someone took her from us." Her words settled over the courtroom like a quiet invocation, soft but undeniable. Daniel testified as well, his voice deeper, steadier. He spoke not of the violence, but of the years that followed, the birthdays without her, the nights he lay awake imagining the life she should have had. He spoke of the way the city changed, how the fog still drifted over the same road she had walked, and how he carried her memory like a lantern through every stage of his life. Throughout these testimonies, Mercer remained still. His eyes did not rise. His shoulders barely moved. He seemed to fold inward, as though the truth being spoken around him pressed him into a smaller and smaller shape. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was tense with expectation. The jurors filed in, their expressions solemn. The foreman stood and delivered the words that families had waited decades to hear: guilty on all counts. For a moment, nothing moved. A breath held collectively, suspended in time. Then Rosa closed her eyes, a single tear sliding down her cheek. She did not cry out. She simply exhaled, a quiet release of years of waiting, years of carrying grief heavier than most could imagine. Daniel placed a hand gently on her arm. Alina watched from the back of the courtroom, feeling the same quiet shift she had sensed when she first opened the evidence box. A long-closed door had opened. The weight of absence had lightened, if only slightly. As Mercer was led away, a hush followed him, a silence shaped not by sympathy, but by the gravity of justice served at last. Outside the courthouse, the air was cool, the sky streaked with the soft light of late afternoon. Families gathered near the steps, speaking in hushed voices, embracing each other, sharing memories that had been carried alone for too long. Rosa stepped aside with Daniel, holding the Polaroid against her chest. She looked toward the horizon, where the fog began to roll in once more, drifting through the harbor in slow, pale ribbons. But it no longer felt suffocating. It felt like a curtain lifting, revealing something long obscured. Elena joined them, her expression tired but warm. The three stood together in a moment that felt both heavy and strangely peaceful, bound by the knowledge that truth, however delayed, had finally found its path. For the first time in years, Harbor Vista felt like it could breathe again. In the months after the verdict, Harbor Vista moved with a slower, steadier rhythm, as if the city itself needed time to breathe again. The fog still rolled in over the harbor each evening, but it no longer carried the same weight it once did. People walked with a lighter stride along the familiar routes, and conversations that had long been whispered in tense undertones shifted toward gentler reflections. For the first time in decades, the silence that hung over the city felt like peace rather than absence. Rosa found herself waking earlier, making coffee in a kitchen that felt different even though nothing in it had changed. She placed the Polaroid on the windowsill where it caught the soft morning light. The sun no longer washed the colors into something sorrowful. Instead, the faded hues seemed warmer, like a memory returning to its rightful place. Sometimes she sat at the table simply watching the light move across her daughter's image, grateful not for closure, but for the truth finally spoken aloud. Daniel visited more often. He carried with him a steadiness shaped by years of loss and responsibility. But now there was something else, a quiet assurance that the story that had overshadowed his life no longer defined its edges. He still paused when passing the street where she was last seen, but now he did so to honor her, not to wonder what remained unanswered. The burden had shifted. Memory had become less of a weight and more of a presence he chose to carry. Detective Elena Ruiz continued her work in the cold case office, but Mara's file remained on her shelf longer than most. She kept it there not out of necessity, but out of respect. Every time she glanced at the box, she was reminded of the long arc of justice, how fragile it could seem, how relentless it could become when given even the smallest chance. She still received quiet thank you notes from families she had helped over the years, but Rosa's message stayed pinned above her desk. Thank you for not forgetting her. Around town, people spoke differently about the past. At the diner, Lita kept a small framed print of the enhanced Polaroid near the counter, not as a reminder of tragedy, but as a symbol of what persistence could uncover. Javier, the journalist, wrote an article reflecting on the case and the many others like it, stories that taught the city to look closer. listen more carefully, and not allow distance or time to dull its sense of responsibility. The Polaroid itself became a quiet emblem of the journey. Once just a faded snapshot tucked into a pocket, it had turned into a map of unintended truth, a witness that waited patiently for someone to understand what it had been trying to show all along. Now, in the soft light of Rose's apartment, it felt less like evidence and more like a small lantern, casting its glow forward rather than back. On the night marking the first anniversary of the verdict, Rosa and Daniel walked along the harbor together. The fog drifted low over the water, but it felt gentle, almost protective. They stopped near the railing, watching the ripples move beneath the muted lights. Daniel took a slow breath. "She'd be proud of us," he said. Rosa nodded, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "She would. And she'd want us to keep living, not just remembering." They stood together for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around them. The years of grief had reshaped them, but they remained anchored by the same truth that had carried them through every season. Love does not fade, and memory, when honored, becomes a form of justice in itself. As they walked back toward the lights of the city, the fog parted slightly, revealing a patch of clear night sky above the water. It was small, almost easy to miss, but it felt like an opening, a reminder that even the heaviest clouds lift eventually, leaving room for something calmer, something healing. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.